from my new book, The Lighthouse Road. It just came out last month. It's a novel, sort of two stories in one. The story begins, and I'll read the opening of it, a woman coming from Norway, immigrating to the United States and expecting to find her aunt and her uncle, and instead finding no one. And she's forced to patch a life together and has a son. And you'll hear that in the opening chapter. And my original intent was that this would just be her story, that I would write a sort of simple, straightforward narrative of a woman, this woman's story. But at the end of the first chapter, which is the first chapter that I wrote, she has this boy. And sort of immediately and spontaneously, when he was born, I thought I want to tell his story at the same time, so that these two lives can sort of reflect each other's and amplify each other's lives. And didn't exactly know what I was getting into, but I like what's happening with this book. And so I hope you'll indulge me in reading to you from both the opening chapter and the first chapter of her son's life as well. Not the whole thing, but some of each. So like I said, it goes back and forth in time, and each chapter begins with a date. And the book begins in November of 1896. Some ancient cold had taken root in Thea Ide's belly, a feeling she'd not yet had, but one she knew meant the time was nigh to deliver her baby. She wanted to walk, felt she must walk, so she rose and stepped into the mess hall and lit a candle. She steadied herself with one hand on the long table, cradled her belly with the other, and began pacing up and down the hall, measuring her contractions by those laps around the board. The contractions started in the small of her back and reached around to her belly where they paused and clenched. She paused too when the contractions burrowed in, and in the throes of each, the absolute chill of the large room was brought down on her. In Norwegian, her mother and only tongue, she said, "My God, what now?" She decided to start a fire. From the tinder box, she took the last scrolls of birch bark and set them under the wood already piled in the stove. She struck a match and lit the birch bark. The fire flared directly, and before the next contraction, the room was already warming. The mice sought the heat beneath the stove without the least fear, gawking at her with eyes the size of pencil tips. She heard the wind raging outside, but was unaware of the snow until she unlatched the door and pushed it open. The dark night was gleaming with snowfall, so much snow that she realized the impossibility of crossing the camp to the Jakes. She said, "Mercy," then hiked up her nightdress and leaned against the mess hall wall. When she stepped back into the mess, she saw Abigail Sturrow readying water for tea. "I'll wake the brothers," Abigail said. The sound of the old woman's voice was a revelation. For more than a year, Thea had worked beside Abigail without having heard it plainly. Abigail said no more, only braved the blizzard herself, leaving Thea to wonder why the brothers needed to be woken. Since Thea discovered her pregnancy, she had avoided its consequences entirely. She had not made plans of any sort, had not prepared herself for the child's arrival, had not considered how she might keep cooking for the Jacks and raise an infant, much less how or where she might deliver the babe. Pacing the mess hall again, the candlelight casting eerie shadows over the pine board walls, the fire rasping in the stove, she realized how imprudent she'd been. She thought, "I'm foolish." Even as she reprimanded herself, another contraction, the strongest yet, clutched her womb. What little she knew of these goings-on came from two memories. The first was of her mother in labor when Thea herself was but 5 years old. This was back in Norway, in their hovel on the treeless banks of Mulka, across the harbor from Hammerfest. Candlelight flickered there, too, and her mother braced herself in bed, alone while she labored. Her mother never made a sound beyond her hairy breathing, and when the child was born still, she merely wrapped it in a blanket and set the corpse on the puncheon floor. The second memory was more recent. As Thea voyaged across the Atlantic just more than a year before, her cabinmate had gone prematurely into a terrible labor. Thea fetched the ship's surgeon herself, and during the tailing hours of a rough storm, she watched that child come into the world stillborn too, so small the mother could hold it in the palm of her hand while she wept. In the early throes of her own labor, Thea understood the silence of her mother and the ululations of that woman aboard ship equally. Abigail Sturrow returned, bringing with her a gust of cold air and snow. She paused to feel Thea's forehead, to to make him each a cup of tea. "Drink this," she instructed, then slunk into their chambers. When she returned to the mess hall a moment later, she came carrying Thea's eiderdown, her cape, her woolen hat. "Dress," she said. "We'll cover you with the goose feathers for the ride to town. I forgot your boots." Thea was about to take another step in her birthing march, but stopped. There was a sluice between her legs, and almost audible pop, and her socks were soaked with something warm and thicker than water. And then there was mud on the dirt floor. Abigail came with the boots, knelt before Thea and said, "You've broken water." She pulled Thea's wool socks from her feet, put on her boots, and laced them up. Outside, the camp foreman's horse stood harnessed to his sleigh in the first inkling of light. The snow had buried everything. Thea was set in the sleigh. Abigail sat next to her, and the taller of the milkman boys took the reins and stood between the women's 4 feet. His brother went into the mess to start the baking. As the horse pulled the sleigh past the Jack's quarters, Thea saw the old bull cook walking toward the mess, no doubt on his way to help with breakfast in her absence. He was the last thing Thea saw before they turned up the ice road and into the trees. She didn't open her eyes again until they reached Gunfront a half hour later. Closer to the lake, the blizzard had a different shape and unruliness. Snow had drifted into sharp ridges all along the breakwater. In town, or what passes town, the roads were covered in snow, so even the horse had trouble passing. There was no sound from the mill. The lights in the travelers' hotel lobby were unlit. Even the dogs that usually ran the streets were nowhere to be seen. At Grimm's apothecary, though, the large front window was aglow, the only sign of life in town. Frost crept down from the corners to cloud the glass. Thea was by then in agony, but still she bore it. The Melvin boy picked her up and trudged through the knee-deep snow to Grimm's door, where he hammered on the glass. Before a minute passed, he hammered again, and Hosea Grimm's daughter, Rebecca, came hurrying across the storeroom floor. She opened the door and said, "Oh, dear," and turned and hollered, "Hosea! Hosea, it's Thea, hurry!" Inside the store, the smell of roasting cape and hanging in the air sickened Thea. She said, "Stink," to which Rebecca replied, "That's Thanksgiving dinner already in the oven." The Melvin boy set Thea on her feet, tipped his hat, and left as though he just delivered a parcel. Hosea Grimm, dressed only in his union suit and a matching toque, came down the stairs 2 at a time. "None of us was sure we'd get you here in time, Miss I. How far along are you?" Thea, answering, fell into Grimm's ready arms. Now Grimm had 2 pots of water boiled beside him, and he was soaking the instruments that Rebecca had earlier arranged. He said, "Well, Miss I, let's say we welcome this child before dark. Let's earn our sup." He spread her legs gently, sliding the sleeping down over her knees. "We must have a look, child." Then he reached into her and pressed, and she thought surely this was the first touch of death. She put her hands around her neck and pressed, and felt her pulse like hammer blows on the palms of her hands. "Very good, child. Excellent. You must be halfway there. No doubt you'll be done by supper time," Grimm said. She looked at him uncomprehendingly, looked at Rebecca, who would not move from her side for many minutes. Outside the window, she could see the snow still falling. The morning passed with difficulty. Several times Grimm consulted his library, and his discourse on the history of childbirth gave over to more imminent concerns. He twice sent Rebecca to his stores, once for morphine and later for a vial of scopolamine. Thea closed her eyes at noon and did not open them again until 2 hours later, when Grimm injected her with another syringe of cold drugs. The moaning that had issued from Thea for hours ceased, and she felt nothing, only that she no longer existed. It was in this state that the child was born. The umbilical cord was tangled around him, and when Grimm held him up by the feet, even the blood coating him was blue. The child had a huge shock of hair on his misshapen head, and his eyes were like slits. Grimm reached for a long-bladed scalpel. He gripped the umbilical cord and sliced through it as though he were cutting tenderloin from the shoulder, catching the child in the crook of his arm. He unwound the cord, first from the infant's neck and then from his legs. Almost instantly, a flush of paleness washed over the boy, and he was alive. Grimm laid the child on a blanket, and Rebecca bathed him. She suctioned the mucus from his throat and nose, and when she did, he let out his first wheeze. While Rebecca tended to the boy, Grimm stood aside, rubbing his furrowed brow. He watched the child open his eyes. He counted the lad's fingers and toes. He noted his hair. He documented his findings in a notebook and set the notebook nearby, and when the child was cleaned and swaddled, he took him from Rebecca and handed him to Thea, who looked wan but relieved. She held the boy, smiled, then wept silently. He recorded this in his notebook too. "You'll need a name for this one," Grim said in stuttering Norwegian. He'd been practicing her language that season. Thea looked at Grim. "A name," she repeated. She looked at her child, pulled him from his place, nestled in the warmth of her neck, and rubbed his cheek. It was so soft it could have been satin. "Ode Einar," she said. "I will call him Ode Einar for my father." Now the child began a long, wheezing lamentation. He clutched the air with his balled fists and kicked under his swaddle. Thea tried putting him back in the crook of her neck, but the child still wailed. She looked at Grim. She looked at Rebecca, who ushered him from the room and returned to her bedside. The child still cried. "Thea, the child is hungry here." And she pulled the loose sleeping gown over Thea's shoulder, exposing her breast. "The child wants to eat." Rebecca took the child from Thea's arm and told her to sit up. And Rebecca positioned the child in Thea's lap and said, "Offer him your breast. Milk, Thea. He wants milk." When Thea looked up uncomprehendingly, Rebecca cupped the baby's head in one hand and Thea's breast in the other and brought them together. And before Thea could fail, the child opened his mouth and leaned toward his mother's breast. The child sucked with astonishing vigor, and Thea felt the life going into him drop by precious drop. In that instant, she realized she was famished herself. The smell of the roasting birds was delicious now, and she felt she could eat a whole hen. But she watched her boy suckle instead. He ate, and Thea wept, and was elated, and would soon die. So then, 24 years later, Ode, who has pieced together a life of his own, he's a fisherman and a boat builder and a bootlegger. Hosea has a bootlegging operation. And Ode has just spent a night in the summertime out on Lake Superior, fetching some barrels of whiskey from some Canadians. And he's sort of been cursing the whole time. He's frustrated with his lot in life and feels that he hasn't really been given a fair shake. And he wants to build himself a bigger boat so that he can make a better life for himself. And this is what happens when he gets back to his fish house. He wasn't expecting to see her inside, but was glad when he did. Sitting there under the open window in the guttery candlelight, her hair down the way he liked, there she was. He stood in the dark corner of the fish house looking at her, she looking back. Neither spoke. It occurred to him as he untied his bootlaces and kicked them off that the candlelight was doing the same work inside that the lightning had been doing out, throwing just enough light to lead him where he needed to be. Before he went to her, he stopped at the end of the workbench he used as his kitchen counter and found 2 clean coffee cups. He poured a finger of hooch into a cup, swallowed it quickly, then poured another finger in each. He stopped short of her, stopped short of the light from the candle, stood there with the coffee cups. His very favorite thing was to watch her rise, to watch her long arms and legs and hair simply move. She moved in the middle of the night in candlelight with the almost imperceptible slowness and suppleness of the sashes. When she flipped her hair and looked down, he said, "What's this, Rebecca?" She glanced up at him, pouted. Only a fool who didn't care about anything would have gone out on that lake tonight. A fool, you say? A proper fool, yes. He stepped to her, set the coffee cups on the floor, and lifted her from the chair on which she sat. I'd never convince you or anyone I wasn't a fool, but I didn't have a choice. I don't make that run and Marcus Oss does, then he wins favor. Oss wins favor and I lose the skiff. I lose the fish house. His voice trailed off. He thought better of saying, I lose the fish house and we've got to know where to go. She looked up at him for the first time since he'd stepped in from outside. The look that came over her face was as a mother's. She reached up and feathered his damp hair away from his eyes. They looked at each other for a long moment before Ode sat her down. He bent and picked the whiskey off the floor, handed her one, and they stepped to his bunk. They drank their whiskey together, 2 sips apiece in harmony. He slid off his soaked pants and hung them over the back of the chair, did the same with his shirt. He lifted first his left foot to remove his sock, then his right. He lay down. Though he was a short man, only 5'5", he was also long-armed and broad-shouldered. He had a chest like a wood stove, was as hairy as a bear. Swallowing her up was as easy as putting his arms around her, which he did as she lay down beside him, using his bare arm as her pillow. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes. It occurred to him that he conducted all the best and easiest hours of his life here in the fish house. His heavy slumber, what few idle afternoons he had whittling and carving, the poker games, the long winter mornings spent mending his gill nets, and now his hours with Rebecca, here under his arms, her impossibly soft skin and the adder of rose in her hair. Their life together went back to the hour of his birth, and he supposed their time together now was something like religion. "How long can you stay?" he said. He was soused at 4 o'clock when the car game ended. "He'll sleep until at least 9. I've time." Outside, he could still hear the wind rocking the trees and the pounding surf out on the point. If there had been no wind or breakers on the lake, he'd have heard the burnt wood river running hard with fresh summer rains. A bigger boat would make life a hell of a lot easier, Rose said. He reached the upturned fish box beside his bunk and took his carving from it, held it up to the candlelight, rode it along the shadows on the wall. The carving was of a boat, the boat he dreamed about. He'd spent all of Christmas week whittling it from a birch wall, whittled the finest details, a motor box, the canopies, a gunwale, even a tow rail. He fashioned a couple of fish boxes and set them in the cockpit. Something with a little bow to her, a strong, high sheer, he said. A cockpit instead of that damn spray hood, a Buddha inboard, 1,000 pounds of keel and skag. A gust of wind blew through the open window and the candle shadow raced up the wall. He moved the cargo with it. And a bell, he said. I damn well want a bell. You'll know I'm home by its ringing. He felt her nestle into him. She loved this hopeful part of him, thought it innocent and childlike. So big, he said, I'll need a berth in the harbor next to the tugs and charter boats. A strong breeze came through the window and blew out the candle. He set his carving down and looked out at the night. A boat like that, and I could make the runs down to Port Arthur myself. I could do business directly all up and down the shore. Could take a boat like that clear across the lake, clear across to the Sioux. We could go anywhere. Anywhere, Rebecca. I'm too old to go anywhere. That's nonsense. Nearly twice your age. So what? You're the prettiest gal in Dunford. Now she smiled and looked at him again. She kissed him lightly on the lips. Tell me more about the boat. Where would you take me? And where did you want to go? She took a deep breath, was thinking earnestly about where she could get. What's the place farthest away in the world? I guess Norway's a fair piece. Where your mother was from. Sure, where she was from. Let's go to Norway, oh, in your boat. What's it like, do you think? I've heard tell it ain't unlike it is here. Oh, Lord, let's choose someplace else then. I told you we could go anywhere. Anywhere, she repeated. They lay in silence, each picturing anywhere as though they might someday get there. She fell asleep. He could tell by how she warmed. So he tilted his head back and looked out the window. Here was the daybreak, the first promise of light coming as deliberate as Rebecca crossing a candlelit room. And there were the pines, swaying in the old wind as though the sobad were played in the slowest of time. Thank you.
Peter, one of the techniques that you use, and I think is so successful, is that you jump ahead in time and then you go back in time. Similar to Geraldine Brooks and David,
The guy who was no flying on
Yeah. So, how do you do that?
You know, I came on that accidentally, as I sort of alluded to before I read tonight. and that I didn't know that Ode's story would become such a big. I mean, Ode is essentially the main character of the book, and when I sat down to plan the book, he wasn't. So I got to the end of the first chapter that I read, and there's this newborn baby, and maybe because I was preoccupied with my own young children's lives at the time, felt like I wanted to imagine what life would be like for this kid. And immediately had to decide how I could do that without just writing her story as part one and his story as part two, because I didn't want to do that. I didn't see why that shouldn't just be 2 books or something like that. And so I puzzled out, some of the main points of his life and decided that I would just see what would happen if I started writing alternate chapters. I love books that do that, whether directly or plainly or through some sort of trick of fiction. But I love that when the lives of characters amplify each other. And so I just started going about it. And what ended up happening, and the whole time I was doing it, I wasn't thinking of it as alternate stories or like a non-linear story. I was thinking of it as a mosaic. That is, I thought I would have all these pieces in the end. Even as I was writing them, I thought, oh, this could go up here. This part that I wrote at the beginning could go back here towards the end of the book. I mean, obviously I would have to do some work on those things. But when I was finally finished with the book, I did what I imagine a person that makes a mosaic does. I laid all the chapters out on the floor and just tried to, imagine the different ways that it could go together. And so it was I didn't come by the storytelling device honestly. I was making it up as I went along. But what I learned as I was doing it is that it was important to be honest with the reader. There were a couple of things that happened in earlier drafts in the book that I took out pieces of information that I was withholding, or surprises that I wanted the reader to that I thought I wanted the reader to come across. But it finally seemed sort of artificial to me, in a way that made the book not as good. And so that's where the difficulty finally came in, was making those decisions. And really, there was nothing scientific about it. I just thought about how I would want to be told the story, or how I would want to discover this story. And that's how I finally settled on it. But I think whether you're telling stories from 1 or 6 points of view, and whether you're telling stories from 1 or 6 different periods in time, I think the thing that I was trying to be most aware of, at least the whole time I was working on it, was that you would get to the end of one chapter and want to start the next one right away to get back to where you were before, so that there would be this readability and page-turning quality that sometimes literary novels don't have. And I wanted there to be that as well.
And you succeeded well.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
And I was intrigued, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Because you withheld some of the information about the relationship between Hosea and Rebecca until quite far into the book. What was your rationale for that? To me, it was a kind of a revelation that surprised me and then made me kind of rethink everything.
Yeah.
So how did you arrive at that time?
Well, I can't, in fairness to the people who haven't read the book yet, I can't say what that revelation is, but it's a pretty big surprise. I wouldn't say it's a big surprise, but it's a big piece of information that is disclosed probably, better than halfway through the book. And it was the one piece that I kept in there because I like this idea. I mean, when you see Ode and he's, in the scene that I just read, he's there with the same woman who delivered his mother, and it's the hope is that it gives you pause and makes you wonder what has happened to bring these two people together. And everything that happens in Rebecca's life is sort of shrouded in this almost unsavory broth. And I wanted her story to be she's definitely one of the main characters, but she's not one of the protagonists. And I thought that it would be okay to leave that big surprise in the middle of the book, so that, and even later in the book, now that I think about it, just as a way of creating that tension, so that the reader was comfortable and got halfway through the book, and then thought, like you said, wait a minute, I have to think about this in a different way. So no, I'm just directly contradicting myself to what I said earlier, but there's room for both things. I mean, too much of that withholding made it seem silly and like I was teasing and taunting the reader. But that particular storyline, I thought, because it it was like a cup of espresso in the middle of a long day, you know, it provides a little boost. So that's why I kept it. Plus, it affects the story in so many different ways. You know, the way the characters treat each other, the way Ode feels about Hosea, and the way that Rebecca feels about Hosea, and all of those complicated relationships. I thought it was worth trying. Any of you college students have any questions?
So, you started working on something. Is it also set up in northern Minnesota?
Yeah, it's a different kind of book, though. It's and I'm not very far into it. I was a lot farther into it and realized I made some big mistakes and had to get rid of a lot of it. But it's an adventure story, I think. Hopefully, like along the lines of Call of the Wild or something like that. The story of a father and son who go into the boundary waters attempting to before it was the boundary waters, attempting to recreate the life of the voyagers for a winter and their misadventures once they get there. But it'll be a little while before that one's
done. I'm trying to get the plot that you know, it's harder to hear it when you haven't read it yet. So, Ode is born, and Rebecca helped deliver him, and now they're lovers. And very next, it's kind of perverse.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe you can even make the argument that it's sort of beautiful in a way, but it's probably more perverse. And I don't know, that leap from that one chapter to 23 years later, I guess. I don't know what my question is, except just, is that really what's going on? And,
That is what's going on. And it's not the only slice of perversion in the book. There are, I mean, Rebecca's, well, yeah, I can't say much more than that, except that there are some shenanigans going on in Gunflint that the average pious Lutheran wouldn't be too fond. Not because we're at a Lutheran college, but because there's also a lot of Lutheran people in the book. So there is that. And Hosea is sort of the perpetrator behind it all. He's the bringer of not only sort of the steadying, influential hand in building this town up, but also he's the one who's got his toes in the mud. And all of those complications and perversions, to use your word, are in a way sort of reflecting back on him. And his character, which came to me like in a flash, very not how characters usually arrive in my mind, but this morally ambiguous man who believes, probably genuinely believes that he's doing well by so many people, yet still has a dark side. I wanted to see what would happen with him. And the relationship between Ode and Rebecca is, I think, I think it's a real love story. I mean, it's pretty simple. They're very fond of each other, and it's a genuine, sort of certifiable love story with a lot of complications. And those complications are the part that make it interesting to me. Not least of which being the fact that she's as much his sister or almost his mother as his lover. But that reflects back on the place that they are and the time that they were in, where this was the wilderness and there weren't a lot of pickings. So, yeah, but I mean, that perversion is, it's intended to be there.
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you show his childhood in the book, or do you just skip to 24 years old?
No, there are chapters that deal directly with his childhood. I think that there's maybe four of them or something. In fact, my favorite chapter in the whole book, which I almost read tonight, but decided not to because it's shorter, is a scene from his childhood. But and there's even in the scenes that don't deal with his childhood directly, there's a lot of sort of, you know, I take my camera to a lot of different angles. And so, for example, there's a scene when Oda's a grown man and he's celebrating a birthday, and he's given, one of the gifts that he's given is pictures of his mother and him when he's big. Jose is, among other things, the sort of the town chronicler and photographer, and he is given, for the first time, he's ever seen a picture of his mother and himself, for that matter, as a baby. And so, there's sort of some explanation of his childhood given there. So there are moments when his childhood are brought to light, even if the chapters themselves don't deal with his childhood. And the reason that there's less of that, there's a couple of reasons. One is for the sake of thrift. I didn't want a 500-page novel, which I might have had to have if I did his whole childhood. But I also wanted to give just enough to explain how he got to where he is and the relationships that he has now, but also to focus on his story now, which is, I think, the most interesting part of the book. So, there was somebody else at their hand up. Am I wrong about that?
So you mentioned earlier tonight that you've gone to the north as a kid. So both books are set in the wilderness, Lake Superior area. Why?
Well, I mean, I'm often asked that question. And in fact, today when we were talking in Kelly's writing class about, whether to write about things people that things, or use your imagination. What I have discovered, I think, in my own writing life is that I require, at least for now, I require the North Shore to be a part of my books for a couple of reasons. The North Shore in that area of the state, anyway. For one, I have such fond and enormous memories of the place. As a kid, we would go there, and I remember the first time I jumped into Lake Superior. I remember the first time I saw a ship going into the harbor in Duluth. I remember the first time I was ever at Bobby Waters in the middle of the night and had to go to the bathroom. Those sorts of, as a boy, and all those feelings that are associated with those memories are excellent fertilizer for fiction. When I finished Lighthouse Road, I started writing a book that was set in Minneapolis, which is where I'm from, and I worked on it for a couple months and wrote 75 pages, and I was just bored because I didn't have the North Shore in the book. I didn't have that ingredient in the stew in it, and quit and started another book that's set up there. So someday I presume I'll write a book that's not set on the North Shore, but for now it's just, I identify so much of my creative life with the North Shore that it's hard to think of writing about someplace else. So I don't.
Did you write either book on location?
As much as I could. But, and I did a lot of research on that, more research than writing up on the North Shore. But, yeah, I would say, I don't know, altogether I spent a month of my life writing somewhere up there. A cabin somewhere, or sitting in one of the little restaurants along the shore or something like that. I wish I could do more. In fact, I wish I was made out of money and I could afford to buy a place up there, but you do need to be made out of money maybe when I get rich or famous, then I sit there. Well, oh,
I was just going to ask, what research did you do for what you just read, the
Lighthouse Road. Well, I was sort of inspired to write the book. The first idea for the book came from this old photograph that I have. It's of a woman who eventually in my mind became Thea. And she's standing outside of a lumber camp in northern, in fact it's in Ontario, but I moved down to Minnesota. And so when I was sort of bringing her to life, I wanted the full logging camp experience, which sounds kind of perhaps dry or something, but there were so many colorful characters, and it's such an interesting, incredible life that those guys led back then. So that's where I started. So I was just reading about that as much as I could. But then Ode was born, and I had to figure out what he was going to be as well. So I spent some time casting him out for that. I toyed with all sorts of different ideas, but I wanted to stay true to the area, which is why he became a fisherman in the end. And so I had to research that. But I was saying earlier that I try to research in such a way that I don't go looking for things as much as I go hoping to find things. I don't think I said it that concisely earlier, but so when I'm reading, I knew, for example, that I wanted Thea to work in a lumber camp, but I didn't go looking for any specific details. I just went looking for details that were interesting and that I thought would make it a and the same was true with Ode and his boat building and his fishing and the bootlegging part of it. I mean, I read about all those things and visited museums and things like that. But always just trying to find something interesting rather than looking for a specific detail. So it's a hard part of the process for me because I just want to use my imagination every step of the way. And there are times, of course, you have to be using your imagination even when you're incorporating the real life details. But it's not so. You have to be true to life. You can't just have them cutting down palm trees in northern Minnesota and things like that. And I'm very unscientific about it and disorganized and constantly misplacing my notes. And so when I have to go back to double check something, it always takes 4 days instead of 4 minutes. That's the thing. It's not easy to research it.
So Safe from the Sea was your first novel. There would have been a lot of research that you would have had to have done for that novel as well.
Yeah, more research for that novel than for the Lighthouse Road.
Yeah. How did you come with the idea of a father-son relationship?
Well, I told the students earlier today, so I'm sorry for you guys hearing the same stories over and over, but when I started Safe from the Sea, I knew nothing about the book except that I wanted it to be set on the North Shore. So I didn't have any idea who the characters would be or that there would be a shipwreck or anything like that. And spent a lot of time just casting about, waiting for the right story idea to strike me, which is what happened. And it was just a sort of, I like to think it's just a natural evolution, what I did was I put a guy in the car almost every day when I sat down to write, put a guy in the car and started driving on the shore. And that's how Safe from the Sea begins. Noah is on his way home to meet his father. And, those details, the fact that Noah will be the character, he'd be going to meet Olaf, the character, and then Olaf will be a shipwreck survivor. Those sorts of details just came kind of, I don't even know, just, I don't want to say accidentally because of course I thought of them. They were my decisions to make, but I wasn't very thoughtful about it, and it took a long time to write the book because of that. I mean, I like how it ended up, but it wasn't like with The Lighthouse Road. I knew Thea's story from beginning to end, more or less, when I sat down to write it, which was a whole different experience writing that than it was writing the first book. So, but the research for that one was way more time consuming. I think because in The Lighthouse Road, it's the human relationships are really what are driving the novel. And in Safe from the Sea, that shipwreck scene is such a centerpiece of the book, and so much of the book depends on what happened to Olaf. And in order to be, true to life, there was a lot of research that I didn't do for that I had no basis for. The closest I'd ever come to even thinking about the boats was listening to Gordon Lightfoot's song, or seeing the boat come into Duluth Harbor, and that's a pretty, those are pretty slim beginnings if you're going to write a whole novel on a shipwreck. So. Any more? Well, I think that I'll sign books if you, I don't think I will, if you have a book you'd like signed, I'll gladly do that for you. Otherwise, thank you all very much for coming, and I look forward to seeing some more of you in class tomorrow, and having had the chance to meet some of you earlier today. And thank you very much. Well, the time and place that I'm writing about is it's not like Rock Island in 2012. It was a little tiny wilderness outpost. There weren't many people there. And I imagined, partly based on my research, but also just on picturing a place like that the pickings will be pretty slim for mates, for lovers and husbands and wives. And these were two people in town that would have sort of naturally been drawn to each other for many reasons, not least of which is that they've known each other for their whole life. So, and I thought it would be interesting to put a couple of people together like that and see what happened. And I think the result is that it's a pretty interesting love story. I spent a lot of time between the ages of 17 and 27 saying I want to be a writer, I'm going to be a writer, and not doing much writing. And the books don't write themselves. You have to sit down every day and be diligent. Even when you feel like you don't have good ideas or you're stuck with writer's block, you have to sit down and do the work. And that's really as simple as it is. And if you do that day in and day out for a period of years, you're going to end up with books. Whether the books are good enough or not to get published will be, someone else's decision, but you'll have done the work, and you can't ask more of yourself than that.